So first impressions after watching that, it was a great art piece. I did feel like we got some things more fleshed out in terms of the proper plot and, sort of the end of Evangelion. I thought it was interesting as we enter the sort of the instrumentality. We see where we end up in episodes 25 and 26, and it's more fleshed out, and some of that self-hate is brought into the picture and stuff as he tries to navigate this existence. Obviously the end is so visually stunning, and obviously at that point there's the merger of humanity into that angel, into that form, essentially like beyond the separation of Adam and Eve, and the reconnection essentially the creation of a new God, or what would be described of as a God, where there is no separation of the self, and there is no ego, there is no id, and what we're left with is, and they chose to show that with the unison between Rei and Shinji there, and the what would be perceived of as a sexual position, but actually it was the merger of the private parts and the removal of sex and sexuality and all this other stuff. All these separators, and so I thought that was really evocative. I thought I did a great job at reconnecting us with Asuka, and allowing her, I think, to get a proper experience, a proper ending, a proper send-off, as brutal as it was. I felt that it did a great job of showing her sort of finally receiving the attention and the love that she so desperately was craving. Shinji, on the other hand, I feel like in the end of Evangelion, we push him further into despair. That's a sensation and a sort of a showcasing of depression that I am not aware of. It's not an emotion or an existence. The idea of like hating oneself so much that they harm others and would rather just be dead, that I don't relate to. My mental issues are different. It's, fear and anxiety and the chasing of validation. Like, those are things that really resonate with me in the original series. Whereas in End of Evangelion, we really lean into the self-loathing and the feelings of worthlessness and despair that obviously we see by his inaction. And pretty much the whole thing is just, he's a sort of wallpaper. Even though every part of the plot moves through Shinji's actually not very active in this part, which is interesting given how much of the movie and how much of the plot revolves around him and in the need to connect with Eva. So that's really particular. And peculiar. The violence and the sexuality, all of that is just like the separations of the self. So first of all, Asuka rejects him, but it's not a rejection like in a normal circumstance in our current life as we know it. Like, it's a rejection of like the self and the rejection of the identity. Asuka, in that case, I feel represents the separateness. In a sense, it continues the feeling of separation by killing her, or by choking her. All of a sudden, that's when, there's that moment where he chooses which path to go down. He kind of actually flip-flops because he chooses the path, of removing the id. But then once he removes the id, he realizes he actually prefers the id. And for whatever reason, Rei/God/ whatever that entity is, chooses to acquiesce to him and says, okay, well, you can go back to that, therefore forfeiting its own existence. And then obviously we see the stuff that we saw in 25 and 26, even though that's a bit more of an abrupt ending. Obviously it's a much more optimistic and happy and, I think more wholesome congratulations. It's a good ending. Maybe the separation of the self is actually not so bad when you consider that the alternative is this unified morphing where there is no separation. And these are concepts that I think are really difficult for people to grasp / understand / even consider. We don't actively ever talk about the death of the self, the death of ego, the death of id, the death of identity. What does it mean? What is your identity? These are things that, as one grows up, especially in this age bracket, that's where we start to unravel and discover the finer aspects of ourself. I think End of Evangelion is a beautiful representation of puberty, of maturity, of growing up, of trying to find oneself, more so than it is about like the end of the plot. While there are some plot bits in there that I think were really, really helpful to get a little bit more of the connecting pieces. I did like, all the sort of overarching plots of the thing, but then it went back into that like art house style thing. And I will say that I think I prefer the ending experience of 25 and 26 more than this, where it's essentially just, and I found it interesting too, like all the deeply uncomfortable and unnerving sexual undertones. Those are also there to both talk about the dehumanization, to talk about the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of the self and the self-satisfaction, self-gratification. I also think that that's also like a natural part of the separation, where sex as the act of sex is something that we do to reunify with, especially when you think of the conversation around, the idea that like when you are in that act, you are actually like blending the selves and blending the id so that it's one unit until you finish, and then all of a sudden you're back to the separateness. They talk about how the id and the ego, I gotta be careful because of just the nature of the internet with videos and stuff, where like there's a moment where there's a separation of the self and you are imbued as one, much like we see at the end. So the noises and the acts and all the sort of impropriety that we see that's kind of unnerving, those are all aspects of this that I think go deeper. I don't fully understand all the visuals I saw, the spear coming back and the Evangelion living on, and essentially what I'm gathering is that Yui wanted to essentially become a deity herself to carry on the legacy. But then I'm also thinking to myself, well, maybe it's just the idea of like legacy in totality and like what it means to have legacy. So, the end of Evangelion is a very interesting movie. I personally don't think it was required viewing. I enjoyed it because I enjoy the property and like I've fallen in love with Evangelion. I thought it was a really, really deep look at, the self. And I'm not fully understanding why there's that moment of choking out at the end with Asuka. I think it's to do with the fact that we just revert back to what we know, even though he asks to be separate from to no longer to have separate identity. In that moment when she caresses his cheek and he cries, it's almost like the acceptance of the self, even though she still calls him whatever she says there at the end. So overall, like visually, obviously a 10 out of 10. I also thought that using a lot of classical music and spinning it in its own way was a really interesting touch, because these are taking classical pieces and modifying them to fit into a context is a very interesting approach to classical music, especially these particular pieces, which were not written with context in mind. These were pieces of of music that were written for the sake of being written, complete or total music or whatever the term is. So to give them context, and even in the moment when we see Asuka, like really, she has that 20 seconds or so, or per each Eva with the S2 chip, it's actually an elegy to her. It's actually like a song of mourning that brings on her eventual death, but the way that she goes about that is really powerful. And it's, so even though the music is sad, through her power, and we know that she will eventually succumb and die, she still retains strength through that, which is really powerful and really beautiful. It was really evocative, the musical choices here and also the music itself. Obviously too, when we enter into the religious aspects, obviously the Christian and Catholic and the Christianity symbolism, we do often get chorus. There were several moments in the series itself that were really poignant. But so those are my kind of impressions on the end of Evangelion. I thought this was really good. I thought it was, for me, it was an 8 out of 10 experience. I kind of didn't care for the ending bit, only because it was a little bit beyond the cerebral and it entered into a different kind of plane. I thought visually it was a 10 out of 10. I thought story-wise, I think it falters a bit as well. But I do appreciate that we get sort of more context of the overall story. I still think ultimately for me, the story of Evangelion, the on-the-nose storytelling, is ultimately more interesting. The subtle aspects of it, the interplay, the interpersonal relationships, that's where the complexity comes in. And I feel like it really nails those things. But yeah, when it tries to sort of hard pivot, that's when it loses me a little bit. So, I give the movie itself an 8 out of 10 experience. And yeah,